Good afternoon. I'm David Wilcove, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the first of this academic year's David Bradford seminars, sponsored by the Center for Policy Research on Energy and the Environment. And our speaker this afternoon is David Edwards. David is Professor of Conservation Science at the University of Sheffield. David has an interesting academic background. He got his doctorate from the University of East Anglia, studying plant-animal mutualisms in the New World tropics. He had an abiding interest in the tropics, as well as a strong interest in conservation. That latter interest in conservation he developed through postdoctoral positions both here at Princeton and at James Cook University, where he began studying aspects of land use change on tropical biodiversity, primarily in Southeast Asia. And so that work included questions related to logging, agriculture, and as his lab has grown, he has increasingly become interested on the interactions between land use change and climate change, and how combined they affect biodiversity, as well as some of the policy mechanisms that can be used to protect biodiversity in the tropics, including economic incentives, payment for ecosystem services, that sort of things. David's work, in my mind, is exceptional for many reasons, not the least of which he works at multiple spatial scales, from global analyses to site-specific studies. It combines field work and data mining. And he and his lab have worked on a variety of organisms over the years. But I have to say that David has a special fondness for birds that, in turn, gives me a special fondness for him. It's a real pleasure to welcome back to Princeton, David Edwards.
Thank you, David. Well, thank you so much for the extremely generous introduction, David, and thank you everyone for coming along. I'm delighted to be back. So, we're going to think about managing tropical agriculture to minimize conservation losses. So let's start with a simple fact. Primary tropical forests, such as that in Southeast Asia, have undisputed value for conservation. They are the true powerhouses of global terrestrial biodiversity, harbouring a whole suite of enigmatic species. But tropical forests are under enormous threat, and primarily that threat comes from conversion to agriculture. Between 1980 and 2012, 154 million hectares of forest were converted to farmland. We usually measure things in the metrics of whales, and when we do that, that's 77 times the area of Wales has been converted. Concurrent with that loss of forest has been a massive loss of biodiversity. We're interested in the black bars here. They are the developing world, the tropics, and we've got the percentage of threats attributable to agriculture on the y-axis. So approximately 40% of species on the IUCN Red List are threatened because of agriculture, around 60% on the near threatened list because of agriculture. Now that might not be an enormous problem if we don't expect agriculture to continue its expansion, because of course we can work with these species, we can try to save them. But there are reasons why we expect agriculture to continue to grow at a very substantial rate. Perhaps the key one is that we have a rapidly expanding global population. It's nice work by Gerland here, suggests that by the end of this century, we will have 11 billion people. It's about 3.5 billion more than we have today. And in particular, we'll see a massive rise in Africa. We also live in a more affluent world. And a more affluent world, it turns out, is a more hungry world. Now, our x-axis here is GDP, and our y is our calorific intake. When we're at this end of the x-axis, we're talking about people who do not get enough food. Morally, we have a moral obligation to bring these people into out of food poverty. But if we look at the red dots, we're already talking about wealthy people, and those people are eating ever more than perhaps they need. Does anyone know who that is at the top right there? Ronaldo, the world's greatest goal scorer in football, as I would call it, soccer. I'll translate for you. And it turns out that if we look at the global overweight problem, I'll call it, we're seeing across most of the world a near doubling the number of people who are overweight. We know that's the case in Europe and the US, but Latin America, about 60% of the population are overweight. That's 1.5 billion adults on planet Earth that are currently overweight and obese. That is growing. So we're eating more than we need as well. We're also transitioning to a more meat-based diet over time. And a more meat-based diet, of course, involves a lot more land use. It involves a lot more, in this case, carbon dioxide emissions. The bar down the far right there is ruminant meat, cattle and lamb. And beef and lamb are extremely costly environmentally, but their consumption grows. So all that in combination means that this nice study from David Tillman suggests that in the next 40 or so years, we need to see agricultural production grow by 60 to 100%. So I would argue that the future of tropical biodiversity is going to be increasingly placed in the hands of those agricultural producers and policymakers. I won't talk about this, but there is also a substantial demand side of the equation. The consumers and the consumer choices that we make here in the US and Europe, as well as in the developing tropics, will also shape farmland. But I won't talk about how we might manage that. So we're going to spend the rest of the talk focusing around this question. How can we manage farmland in the tropics to minimize biodiversity loss? There are many different ways, but I'm going to speak about three broad areas we've been focusing on in our research. The first, we could look to direct the expansion of crops to places where there is a low biodiversity value. We can try to design or manage our farming better. And we could look to take areas of marginal production, very low yielding areas, out of production to make more space for conservation. As David's already mentioned, when we're doing this, we use rigorous field studies, we're incorporating environmental economics, we're considering the role of different policy frameworks. And I work on a variety of crops. We work on rubber, and in particular, we're working in the talk today, we're going to look at studies on oil palm and cattle farming. So if we focus first on directing expansion to low diversity areas and oil palm. I'm sure many of you know, but oil palm is rapidly expanding. 9.5 million hectares more oil palm in 2015 than there was in 2000, and that continues to increase to date. So what if we try to expand oil palm in low diversity areas? So within the tropics, there are in fact many areas that have quite low biological value. Areas such as that have been burned multiple times. They're now an imperetta grassland. We have erosion impacted areas, areas that have been converted to farmland already and that are in some poor production state. So a nice study by John Garcia-Rao pointing at this particular region of eastern Colombia, the western Llanos. But their study, although highlighting this area, used coarse grain layers. So what we wanted to do, the danger of doing that is you might overlook important habitat at smaller scales than they were able to work at. Now there are two habitats in that region You have anthropogenic grasslands, where there was formerly forest or some semi-natural grassland, some natural grassland system, and there are natural forest patches. It looks like this. These are 2 or 3 species of non-native grass, and then you have native forests. Both are at risk. So the question then is whether oil palm can develop at minimal cost to either 2 of those habitats. This is James Gilroy. He was my postdoc. He did this work and quite a lot more of the work that we'll see in the talk today. So enormous credit for James, and thanks goes to him. So what we've done in this study is we've looked at 4 different groups. We've looked at terrestrial ants sampled with unbaited pitfall traps, dung beetles sampled with baited pitfall traps. We've looked at birds sampled with point counts, and herpetofauna through active searching. And we have 3 regions in the Western Llanos, each containing oil palm, a pasture and forest. So there are many ways of looking at the impacts of land use change on biodiversity. I'm just going to present 2 of those from this study today. So the first would be species richness. The second would be occurrence of forest species, those that we might think have the most conservation value, within oil palm and pasture. So if we focus on species richness, we could plot on for our 4 different groups along the x-axis, our total species richness on the y. We can plot on our forest species richness. If we then look at these non-natural pastures, we see that in each case it has roughly half the number of species present in those landscapes relative to forest. Now, if we were to turn a pasture into an oil palm plantation, we would, in fact, do some interesting things. For dung beetles and herps, we would recover the species richness of a primary forest. In the context of ants, we would move ourselves to about halfway back towards where we would expect to be in a forest, but for birds, we would see a minor reduction. Focusing then on these forest species, we see that for 3 of the 4 taxa, not for birds, that there is a major reduction in the occurrence probability of forest species in orange there, in pastures, relative to oil palm. In other words, if we have oil palm replacing these non-native pastures with palm oil, we will see a substantial recovery, in fact, for 3 groups. So forest patches have the most species. Oil palm is more species rich than pasture, aside for birds. More forest species are occurring in oil palm than pasture. And what that suggests is that we may have found a place where we can develop oil palm industry at minimal biodiversity cost. We also have found that it would be vital to ensure we do preserve the remaining forest patches. Now that's all very well, but how might we engage the oil palm industry to expand in this manner? And something I want to talk through is the potential of sustainability labelling. So the oil palm industry has been under intense media and consumer pressure to improve its sustainability. One example would be Greenpeace's campaign against Nestlé, in which they rebranded a famous Nestlé product as a chocolate-covered orangutan finger. And the outcome of that was Nestlé decided that they would no longer purchase deforestation palm oil. These 400 retailers worth $3 trillion are going to remove all net deforestation from their supply chains by next year. Whether they achieve that, who knows, but these are exciting times. So if you want to remove deforestation from your supply chain, there might be a cost to that. This is Roman Carrasco from the National University of Singapore, and myself and Roman have been pondering this question. And we've rephrased this question slightly as how much would using a deforestation-free oil palm increase the price of the Mars that you might choose to buy at the end of this talk. So just think how much you might have to pay extra for a moment. Right, I assume you've all got a number. So what we do is we simulate where to put new oil palm across the tropics to avoid deforestation. So we want to meet 2025 production when we're doing that, and we calculate the net profit of the current land use all across the tropics, and then we predict the potential profit for oil palm in each of those locations, and we're able then to choose the most profitable cells for oil palm, and we would assume that production would move to those. So according to our models, this is what the tropics would look like in 2025. It's a bit difficult to see, but we have some areas of red. These are our areas of oil palm expansion. And you have some areas in Borneo there. That would be the Imparata grasslands. We have the Llanos. We've already talked about that in the north of South America. Some Beni grasslands in the south. And the flanks of the Congo Basin all represent places where we can expand oil palm and not deforest. But what does that do to the price of the Mars you're going to buy? Well, firstly, it does increase the production costs of oil palm by approximately $30 per tonne. And that translates into an increased Mars price of, well, not $1, not 10 cents. It wouldn't even cost you 1 extra cent. And in fact, it would cost you 0.1 extra of a cent. And the reason for that, of course, is nobody eats a tonne of crude palm oil, I hope. So one thing you can learn from today's talk, hopefully, is that you might think that there is a role in your life for deforestation-free products. Here is a caveat. There is, unfortunately, not enough forest-free area in the tropics to meet current oil palm, the future demand for oil palm beyond 2025. So that brings us to consider the potential for using higher yielding varieties. Perhaps we can produce more crop per hectare on existing land and allow us to stop deforestation. So this is Sime Darby's super palms variety. They think they can have a 250% yield increase with this variety to 10 tonnes of crude palm oil a hectare. There's been genome sequencing of oil palm, so we might be able to introduce pest and drought-resistant strains. And this seems great. But while there is big potential to save forest by doing this, there are also potential risks. So myself and Roman and others argued in this article that there are some significant dangers of yield increase. So this is some work done by my current PhD student, Felix Lim. He's been modelling expansion of oil palm in Indonesia. And what we've got here is we've got 5 years along the x-axis, and we've got the area of converted. And if we don't see any yield increases, then Felix predicts that we'll see about 1 million hectares more oil palm in 5 years. If, however, we increase the yield by 15%, he would predict nearly 5 million hectares of expansion. And the reason for that is that although there is a price drop, you're also producing a lot more crop, and consequently per hectare, and then consequently you have far more positive land rents. It is more profitable now to farm oil palm. As a consequence of that, we will be expecting to see deforestation. These are his projected outcomes for carbon loss. So we see a lot more deforestation, a lot more carbon emissions. So what we would need is governments, in this case the Indonesian government, to zone areas for crops, high-yielding crops, but also to zone areas that would be at risk. In other words, profitable areas for oil palm as forest estate. So now we're going to move on and think about if we can design farming better. And we're going to think about cattle farming now. So there are many different ways we might think about incorporating wildlife in landscapes. I'm sure many of you have heard of this being split out as the land sharing and land sparing debate. On the left, we may incorporate wildlife and wildlife features in amongst our farmland. On the right, under sparing, we might farm very intensively and spare land elsewhere. It's fair to say there's been intense debate around this paradigm, but the previous examples have been ignoring the potential important roles of surrounding landscapes. And so James and myself and others wanted to understand how the proximity of farmland to contiguous forest might affect the trade-off between sharing and sparing. So if we return to our schematic, we can now imagine a piece of primary forest, a large block next to our farmland, and we might expect some source sink dynamics, some spillover of wildlife out from that forest into the farmland as a generating rescue effects. So we've been working on this in the tropical Andes. Why would we go there? It's the most endemic rich place on planet Earth. It has extremely high risks of extinctions. It has a long history of farming, particularly cattle farming. So we focused here in the Western Cordillera of Colombia. We have 3 broad landscapes within which, in those squares, we sample green squares in forest and red squares in pasture. We sample birds, 3 point counts per square. We did the same method for dung beetles. We get the same results, so I'll just present the birds. So we sample at a particular point. We stand effectively, we're sampling from the middle, and we have an area of habitat in which we're monitoring, and that area of habitat has a certain amount of wildlife-friendly habitat attached to it. So that's our wildlife-friendly index. That point also has a distance to nearest forest attached to it. So what we do is we take our raw species data and those 2 metrics, and we run some simulations. We generate species occupancy probabilities against our wildlife-friendly index and our distance to contiguous forest. And those probabilities look something like this: the wildlife-friendly index going from nothing in your habitat to near complete forest, and our occupancy probability on the Y. And the black thick bar is our mean bird. The average bird has a higher occupancy probability as you incorporate more wildlife-friendly features in the landscape. Find the opposite pattern for distance from forest. Close to forest, we have a higher occupancy probability than as you move further away. So we take those models and we then run some simulations. We simulate a land sharing landscape, we simulate a land sparing landscape. So we have our contiguous forest and we have farmland at different distances. So at 500 metres under sharing, we have 5 farms, each with an amount of the farm given over to wildlife-friendly farming. Under sparing, we have fewer farmed landscapes, entirely farmed, but we can now spare some land for conservation. And then we model that moving out away from the contiguous forest to 1,500 metres. So I'll present a couple of metrics we've looked at. Firstly, we may look at the number of species, count up the species for which each strategy is best, and we can divide that by species that were winners from farmland and species that were losers from farmland. And we could also ask about the total species richness or taxonomic diversity within our landscapes. So this is what we find. We have our distance from contiguous forest on the x-axis. We have our number of forest birds, winners on top and the losers beneath, on the y. So at 500 metres, we find that the winners at the top, all of those species pretty much would do best if we farmed via land sharing. So if you have higher abundance in farmland than forest, you're a winner and you would do best with land sharing. If you're a loser from agricultural expansion, then you would, largely speaking, do best from land sparing. As we move away from the forest, winners continue to do best from land sharing. In the context of losers, however, we start to see that land sparing becomes by far the best strategy as you move away from contiguous forest. If we think about this then in terms of landscape level species richness, we count up all those species in our landscapes, then we can see that at 500 metres there are a few more species under sparing than sharing, but as we move far further from the forest edge to 1,500 metres, we have a near halving of the projected species richness under sharing and sparing. So our simulations suggest that land sparing is best for biodiversity. You would have more species with higher occupancy probabilities under sparing. You would have higher landscape level taxonomic diversity. So we don't just want to protect kind of species for species' sake, we're also interested in phylogenetic diversity, the evolutionary history contained in our communities, and we're interested in the functional roles that those species may play. So we can look at two other forms of diversity as well, and we use the same simulations to do that. So we focus first on phylogenetic diversity. We see in the green bar on the top left there against the orange bar, we lose about 800 million years of evolutionary history when we convert a forest to farmland. If we farm with a land-sparing approach, we retain largely the same phylogenetic diversity, however far your farmland is from forest, but under sharing we find that we lose a lot of phylogenetic diversity with distance from forest. And we find that same pattern for functional diversity as well. So land-sparing will protect the most taxonomic, phylogenetic and functional diversity in cattle landscapes. It is increasingly better as you move further from contiguous forest edge, and consequently the apparent benefits of land sharing are evidently confounded with distance from forest edge. So given that landscape configuration is a critical, critically underpins the kinds of diversity you might expect, there's also the potential that landscape configuration would interact with other emerging threats that face diversity. So I'm going to focus on just a couple of other emerging threats. The first is climate change, and the work that Rebecca Senior, who's now actually based with David here at Princeton, has been doing, thinking about climate connectivity and how that manifests under different forms of land use change. And another one of my PhD students, Will Symes, was thinking about this in the context of wildlife trade. So we'll focus first on Rebecca's work on climate connectivity. If we imagine this green band, this represents a very large-scale area of habitat. And we can have a species here, its entire range, and that species will suffer global warming in that particular location. Let's say it would suffer 4 degrees Celsius of warming. Now either that species has to adapt, or, and most likely this is the case, it will be unable to adapt. The only option remaining is to move. And so it will need to move to a different place that has the equivalent climate of its original range. The problem, of course, with so much deforestation occurring is that we may find the severing of this connectivity. So that species could endure 4 degrees C, it could move, but in this case now it can only get to a place that still means it will suffer 2 degrees Celsius of warming. It cannot reach its analogous climate anymore. So what Rebecca has done is she's taken, this is 2012 forest cover, and asked if you lived in a particular place in the tropics, can you reach an analogous climate which is 0, or indeed a climate that's cooler than your present day climate under global warming, and that would be in blue. What we're really interested in is the reds. The reds tell us that species are no longer able to move from where they currently are to an analogous climate under future climate change, and many will suffer 4 degrees Celsius of warming as a consequence. Scarily, 62% of tropical forest is already incapable of facilitating range shifts to analogous climates. Furthermore, when Rebecca looked at how climate connectivity has changed, she did so from 2000 to 2012, she found that we lost 27% of our climate connectivity through deforestation in that time frame. That tells us 2 key things. We need to try to halt deforestation from farming, and we also need to try to think about where we can generate restoration to reconnect some of these critical climate gradients. Here, what Rebecca has done, she's got area of forest lost on the X and the amount of connectivity you lose on the Y. The observed results are in blue, and they show us, indeed, as we lose more forest, we see a non-linear increase in the amount of area of connectivity we lose. We know that most agricultural development happens with a kind of contagion effect. So we would expect those areas to be quite large that are lost. If you have random forest loss, however, so we start to break out from areas where we see losses and we spread that over wider areas, it's more random in approach, we see that those climate connectivity losses would be much more substantial. What that means, I think we have some exciting work to do on this, is to think about what that means for land sparing and sharing, but it would look like farming in a sparing way where you convert a large patch and leave everything else protected would be more optimal for retaining climate connectivity. So we flip to wildlife trade. Many species are traded. We're interested here in forest species, species that are dependent upon forest. Those are 3 such species that are commercially traded within Southeast Asia. So we take 77 commercially traded species, and what Will Symes has done, he's taken their ranges and he has looked at the remaining forest that they have, which is in green, and he's divided that forest by more than 5 kilometres from an edge, in other words where a cage bird trapper will tend not to go, and he's got those places where they will go in pale green. So when we plot that out for our 77 species with distance from forest edge on the X and the population suppression on the Y that we would expect through trapping, we in fact find that on average 37% of birds are likely to have been trapped already through accessibility issues for trapping. This is what we think that means in the context of the IUCN Red List. Habitat loss directly itself is causing the losses in blue, but this ability for trappers to access remote locations or no longer remote locations is in red. It's a very substantial extinction risk. And again, what that tells us is that probably if we farm very wide scale and try to incorporate habitat patches in and amongst our farmland, we are going to be causing lots of accessibility for trappers issues. So perhaps farming with land sparing will be better again. So to summarise that, designing farming better is absolutely critical for biodiversity conservation. We need to reduce the direct negative impacts of farming, and we also need to be very aware about trying to reduce the interacting threats, things like climate change and wildlife trapping, that farming can interact with. A quick mention of something we really need to be getting to grips with now. It's the socio-economic and cultural underpinnings of how we manage farmland and how those interact with whether we can be farming in a land-sparing way. So I'm going to move to the final part of the talk. We're going to think about taking marginal areas out of production. And intuitively, this might seem like quite a weird thing to be promoting. We need more food, and here we're talking about having less food. We are talking about land which is extremely low yielding and has potentially got big conservation threats attached to it. So we may want to stop farming in those marginal places and try to intensify elsewhere. Anything we try to do in conservation, of course, is underpinned or undermined, perhaps is a better way of saying it, by our financial lack of resources. And in this context, the emergence of carbon funding, REDD+, is a very exciting prospect. The market is continuing to grow, and projections suggest it might reach $30 billion a year, which is far more than global conservation has to spend. So what we're hoping for is carbon and biodiversity co-benefits. We need to have convergence amongst 3 things. Firstly, of course, we need the carbon. We need to have some significant biodiversity protection potential, and we need it to not cost too much money. So previous works have been focusing on avoided deforestation, but we've been looking at this from a different angle, focusing on whether there's a role for enhancing carbon via natural regeneration through the abandonment of farmland. So we'll be in Colombia again, back to these lands. 75% of all of Colombia's farmland looks like that, very low yielding cattle pasture. But if you take those cows away, over time you do start to see some forest regeneration. And so we need to know three things. As those forests return, we want to know how much carbon they have. We want to know how much biodiversity returns. So we've measured carbon, we've measured bird and dung beetle diversity. And then we need to know how much it will cost for us to take out those lands in dollars a tonne of carbon dioxide. So in terms of carbon, on our y-axis we've got above ground carbon stock in tonnes per hectare. We have pasture on the left, and primary forest on the right, and secondary forest carbon stocks in the middle. Pasture doesn't, unsurprisingly, have much carbon, 12 tonnes per hectare. A primary forest has around 230 tonnes per hectare. And as we regrow secondary forest, after about 25 to 30 years, we see roughly half the carbon stock of a primary forest. In the context of biodiversity, we've now plotted our species occurrences, their abundances in primary against pasture, and we don't see a pattern really. When we do the same thing for secondary forest, we now see that if you're common in a forest, primary forest, you're also quite common in a secondary. We could focus on our really rare birds, those 40 species that are IUCN red listed and or range restricted. And when you have farmland, you've lost most of them. Only 11 species remain, and where they occur, they're very rare. They're 70% lower in their occurrence. But in those secondary forests, 33 of the species are there, and they are now only 20% lower in occurrence probability. They're nearly at the same abundance. So we've got half the carbon stock recovery in 30 years. We have much recovery of primary forest diversity, a whole suite of IUCN red listed and endemic species, and consequently we have big carbon and biodiversity co-benefits of restoration. So that leads us to our final question, which is what is the cost in terms of carbon payments to restore 1 hectare of forest? So first of all, we need to work out how much farmers are earning from their farmland, and the opportunity cost of taking out cattle pasture is a median of $150 per hectare across a 30-year time frame. These are not wealthy people. And there are associated costs of managing and implementing this project. So this is what we find. On our x-axis we have our carbon market price in dollars per tonne of carbon dioxide. On our y we have the cost of reforesting 1 hectare of pasture. So if we start at $0 per tonne of CO2, that's the equivalent of not having a carbon market. There's no money flowing. And so effectively this is the price that an NGO would have to pay to obtain a hectare of pasture. And that's about $300 per hectare, which is right. In the more remote pastures across Colombia, that's roughly what NGOs are paying. If we introduce a carbon market, we start to move across this x-axis, and as the price that the market pays increases, so the amount of money you have to pay to obtain this 1 hectare falls. And we're interested in the break-even point here, where the NGO now has to spend no money at all. The carbon market can meet all of the costs of the project, and that's $2 per tonne of carbon dioxide. If the carbon market continues to pay more money going further, then what happens is it becomes more profitable for farmers to grow carbon than it is for them to grow cows. So a RED Plus break-even point of $2 per tonne of CO2, what does that mean? If you compare that to avoided deforestation, but Brendan Fisher's work from East Africa, $6.50, Dan Nebstad from the Amazon, $10, Brendan and David and myself did some work from Southeast Asia, $18 to $46 per tonne of CO2. So these are very competitive prices. We can buy this land out very cheaply. And it offers big carbon and biodiversity co-benefits. So the key question then, or the thing we have to do, is to identify other places in the tropics, other marginal, low-profit farmland for secondary forest regrowth. Something that we've just been tackling, my PhD student Oscar Morton, in the context of shifting agriculture, or slash and burn, which is a very widespread farming form across the tropics. And in northeast India, we believe that for $1.50 or less per tonne of carbon dioxide, we can work to enhance carbon stocks in those landscapes. So with that, I'll make a few concluding remarks. Agriculture is the key driver of the global extinction crisis. There are many ways that we can improve our conservation outcomes in farmland. We could think about placing it better. we can design it better, and we can intensify, provided we have zoned areas for sparing, and we can buy out low-profit farmland in particularly conservation-threatened regions. So what we need to do is exploit these mechanisms far more effectively as we move forwards in enhancing our protection networks. I must thank all of these people, without whom none of that work would have happened. Our collaborators, the Instituto Alexander von Humboldt, have been unerring in their support, and our funders. And with that, I'll be very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions for David?
Thanks for the talk. I thought the last part was especially interesting, the conclusion with the break-even price being around $2 per ton. Obviously, we think it's not a lot. But I have a question. Is that calculated after assuming kind of that 25 years of secondary forest regrowth? Or like when would the farmer expect to receive that money?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've used a certification scheme which allows payments throughout the process. And there are two reasons that would happen. The first is, as you say, the farmer needs to see money at regular intervals. And so what we've actually calculated there is to rent the land from the farmer, not to buy it. We have a purchasing price as well. It's a little different, but we're renting there. So the farmer is going to get a regular influx of money. The other reason we have to have that anyway is because we don't want to pay too large an amount of money up front. So there's a risk associated to the purchaser as well as the seller of that as well.
David, I'm curious. Oh, please go ahead.
I don't have a question. I just thought I'd make a few observations about how farmers themselves and how the international development organizations can execute a pro-biodiversity plan. I ran a World Bank-sponsored biodiversity fund for several years, and I also built up what is now the largest non-governmental financing fund for agriculture, tropical. And I haven't had a chance to think about it, but just a few quick observations. One is, anybody in the development field is very aware of not all the science that you've done here, but of the problem, of the risks involved. So let me cite an example of, we started working in Bolivia, and the most attractive crop there was soybeans. Soybeans was grown down in the tropical areas around Santa Cruz. And we were not the first ones to finance things, but maybe 20 years after it started. But I noticed that the lands where the first soybean farms had been built, the rainfall pattern had fallen. So there was less rainfall in those areas than before. And so I decided that, all right, I'm not going to finance any of there because they're at risk because of the rainfall problem. But rather foolishly, I said, well, all right, I'll do it north of that area where the rainfall is normal. But of course, you go and clear the forest, and when the rainfall is going to slow down again. So that's a dilemma, and don't know what the answer is, but I'm just explaining some of the problems that financial institutions have in trying to do something about the problem that you described.
I guess a general observation would be that many of you in here are perhaps in graduate school. You don't have to become a scientist based in a university to make massive impact. Perhaps landscape modelers, climate modelers within your organisations could have preempted some of those issues, and there might be very fruitful roles for working with funders, with corporations in helping them enhance environmental goals and successes therein. Thank you. Please.
So in your second kind of question, when you looked at land sparing versus land sharing,
Mm-hmm.
the effect of like distance to closest old-growth forest, any like biodiversity within those landscapes, did you at all look and see, like you then assumed that I guess that old-growth forest would have a consistent level of biodiversity no matter if there was land sharing or land sparing nearby? So I was just wondering if you'd at all thought of like kind of the reverse effect. Like obviously we would probably assume that land sparing would then have a positive effect on that old growth forest that you're looking at in proximity, but since you then said like a statement where then the landscape, you'll be better off doing this, I was just wondering if you'd kind of looked at, reverse.
Yeah, I guess in a way we did, because our samples within the forest were nearer the edge and were further inside. But I mean, ultimately we are talking about large tracts of forest, and so there are potential negative edge effects, and think about the trapping effect then. But so we have effectively accounted for that, but we haven't explicitly looked into that. My view from that is we just need to be retaining, and from Rebecca's work and from Will's work, we need to be retaining large tracts of forests without roads, without populations. Otherwise we have significant fragmentation effects as well, which I think is what is the crux of what you're asking.
The question I wanted to ask is, has anyone looked, when you give, say, a cattle grower payment to take some marginal pasture out of production, has anyone looked to see what those cattle growers do next? Do they take the money and then clear somewhere else, or are they trying to get out of that business entirely?
I'm going to have to be a bit qualitative in my response. Sure. The experiences that I've had and the people I've spoken to suggest that, I mean, people come begging me to buy their land. Right. And they tell me they want to go and live in towns.
Okay.
They've had enough.
The rural emigration.
So the $150 net present value across a 30-year time frame. Most people are earning ravishingly tiny amounts of money. For anyone who's been to the Andes, anyone who hasn't been to the Andes, it's really steep. So you spend your life walking around these massively steep slopes. It's extremely hard work for extremely limited outcome. If they can sell their land, then they're keen to do so and to move away, live in the city or a local village or something.
Any other questions? Well, David, thank you so much for really a
pleasure.